أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والله يحب الصابرين وما كان قولهم إلا أن قالوا ربنا اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وإسرافنا في أمرنا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين فآتاهم الله الثواب الدنيا وحسن الثواب الآخرة والله يحب المحسنين صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allah loves those who are firm and steadfast, sabirin. All that they said was, Our Lord, forgive us our sins and anything we may have done that transgressed our duty, establish our feet firmly, and help us against those that resist faith. And Allah gave them a reward in this world and the excellent reward of the hereafter. For Allah loveth those who do good. God the Exalted and Great has spoken the truth. So, this is from Surah Al-Imran, as many of you, of course, will recognize. And the reason that I chose this is because, as in other ayats of this surah, you have words derived from husn. From which, of course, now husn here, as in the translation you heard, refers to the good, for instance, right at the end. Yeah, but husn, as Urdu speakers know, for Urdu speakers, first of all, it connotes beauty, naturally. Yeah, but actually a better translation would be grace. Yeah, because beauty has been somewhat, the word is a little superficial at this point. Grace carries the kind of moral quality that we want to connote here. Yeah? So grace, goodness, generosity, and excellence. Yeah? In Ahsan, these are obviously the various words derived from this root word husn, which occurs again and again in Surah Al-Imran. And of course, the reason is that this is the Yosin lecture series. So Adab, welcome to the Yosin lecture series, which is Habib University's flagship public lecture series, based on the university's motto of thoughtful intellectual engagement, and it brings to Pakistan leading international scholars whose work has wide-ranging impact and represents excellence in their field. Previous Yosin speakers, we started with Munir Fashe, a Palestinian intellectual, Wali Nasser, many of you will be familiar with him, Maria Clave, Raza Aslan, Noam Chomsky, Ashish Nandi, Azra Raza, and of course today, our very distinguished speaker and a very distinguished friend of Habib University, Professor Thomas Blom Hansen. Yes. So, first let me, of course I need to introduce Professor Hansen further. He's the Reliance Dhirubhai Ambani Professor of Anthropology at Stanford University. He founded and directed Stanford's Center for South Asia from 2010 to 2017. Professor Hansen is an anthropologist of political life, ethno-religious identities, violence, and urban life in South Asia and Southern Africa. He has multiple theoretical and disciplinary interests, from political theory and continental philosophy to psychoanalysis, comparative religion, and contemporary urbanism. Much of Professor Hansen's early field work was done during the tumultuous, intense years in the beginning of the 1990s. He's really the man of the hour, as you will just find out as I go through this. Yeah? Beginning of the 1990s, when conflicts between Hindu militants and Muslims defined national agendas and produced frequent violent clashes in the streets. Out of this work came two books. They're not just books, they're actually classics, really, modern classics, as they say, contemporary classics. The Saffron Wave, Democracy and Hindu Nationalism in Modern India, published by Princeton University Press in 1999. So many of you will immediately think, well, that's exactly the year after the BJP came to power, the first government of the BJP. The softer, milder, and what looks like today, a very kind right, version, which explores the larger phenomenon of Hindu nationalism in the light of the dynamics of India's democratic experience and Wages of Violence, another contemporary classic in the field. Wages of Violence, Naming and Identity in Post-Colonial Bombay, Princeton, 2001, just 2 years after the first book, which explores the historical processes and identity formations that gave rise to violent socio-religious conflict and the renaming of the city in 1995. So obviously, pointedly, in the title of the book, it's still called Bombay. In the early 2000s, Professor Hansen pursued a detailed study of religious revival, racial conflict, and transformation of domestic and intimate life from the 1950s to the present in a formerly Indian township in Durban, South Africa. This resulted in a book entitled, well, beautifully entitled, Melancholia of Freedom. Melancholia of Freedom. Social Life in an Indian Township in South Africa. Again, Princeton University Press, 2012. In addition to these ethnographic engagements, Professor Hansen has pursued a number of theoretical interests in the anthropology of the state, sovereignty, modern convictions, religion, violence, and urban life in the global south. Actually, in terms of the anthropology of the state, it was as a young graduate student at Columbia University that I first encountered. I was a senior graduate student. I got to graduate student late in life. So that I encountered the first book that I read, which was edited by Professor Hansen, States of Imagination. And it was very, very suggestive for us at the time and informed, I know, the work of many people, even in my own department at Columbia University. Hansen is, well, actually, he has finished the book that's written about on your page, which is The Law of Force, and which is about the history of violence in Indian politics. And once again, so as you can see, Professor Hansen has been thinking about these very, very disturbing realities, contemporary realities, for many decades now. And now, of course, it's gone global, what he had been studying in one national context, which, as it turns out, was in fact the vanguard of what was to come. I used to say this when I was in America myself to my white friends, that if you think Pakistan is your past, you're mistaken. Pakistan is your future. As it turns out, South Asia, if not Pakistan, South Asia, is fast becoming the future of other parts of the world, which is, I wonder what you would say about that from a psychoanalytic perspective. By the way, Saffron Wave is, to my mind, I mean, I haven't read all the books on this phenomenon because there's a growing literature, but amongst the books that I've read, it's still my favorite book, and it has very, very interesting psychological, psychoanalytic insights as well. We used to read it also in our part of the core curriculum, Pakistan and Modern South Asia, in that course, in the Habib Liberal core curriculum, which gets me to another aspect why Professor Hansen is the man of the hour in this case, because he, not only in what he thinks about our times, but with respect to the Yosin lecture, we've always been very careful in terms of who we invite, starting, as I said, with Munir Fashe, the Palestinian intellectual, who we invite to give this lecture, because this is a heavy word for us, Yosin. Yeah? It comes from our motto, Qimata kulli imri ma yosin hu, which is a quote from Imam Ali alayhi salam. The worth of every human is in their yosin. No, yosin, yeah. So here, actually, it's a bit of a, as words travel into other languages, naturally, whatever language it is takes a little bit of liberty with the word. Yeah. So in the quote itself, it's yosenahu, and you can't take it apart like that, but we have. And I'm happy we did. Yosin is a verb, yeah? It's what you do, and it evokes qualities. What is it? What kind of thing is it? It's that which produces beauty, grace, generosity, goodness, and excellence in the world, yeah? So all of the people that we read out, so not only is Professor Hansen an excellent scholar, which is evident, but he is also adequate or for the Yosin platform, because he is also very generous. He regularly contributes to the development of institutions in South Asia, and that is our connection with him. He is one of the oldest friends, well before our campus appeared. Right? Yes. Well before our campus appeared. He is a very old friend of Habib University. I think I first worked together with President Rizvi in 2012. Yeah, he was generous enough to invite us, and we gave a presentation on the Habib Liberal Core Curriculum. Since yesterday, he is here with a team to review the Habib University Core Curriculum. He's chairing that team, and I'll introduce some of the other members because they've traveled so far to be with us. So we have Dr. Lynn Stein, who has come all the way from All-In College of Engineering. She's a professor of computer and cognitive science, which is ranked at All-In College of Engineering, which is ranked in the top 2 undergraduate engineering colleges in the US, and she's one of the founding people at All-In, yeah, which has very rapidly emerged as one of the top universities, yeah, in the US, and we are very fortunate to also now have Dr. Stein as a member of Habib University's Board of Governors. So please, another round of applause. And then Dr. Farina Mir, who is a compatriot, is a historian of colonial and post-colonial South Asia, and professor at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Dr. Mir has been associated with Habib University since 2017 also, and has continued to engage with us on many fronts. And last but not least, by any means, he's our new friend. Dr. Brian Penpraise is a professor of physics and astronomy and vice president at SOCA, very interesting University of America. He specializes in global education models, interdisciplinary learning, and fostering global citizenship. So you see, he's both a professor of physics and astronomy, as well as somebody who works on global education models, interdisciplinary learning, and fostering global citizenship through innovative frameworks. Yeah. He has recently co-written with other authors a book on new global universities, in which, thank you also for mentioning Habib University. All right. So anyway, so Yosin, yeah, so this review of our core curriculum. Habib University has just completed its first 10 years. Yeah? We're beginning our 11th year, inshallah. No, we are in our 11th year. Sorry. We are in our 11th year. Yeah, we've begun our 11th year. We're in our 11th academic year. I think it's really a sign of precisely one can only attempt these things, our attempt to hold ourselves to this motto of Yosin. Because we're undertaking a review, yeah, where obviously we put ourselves at risk for the sake of excellence. Yeah, which is of course part of what Yosin is all about. Essen. I think that should be in just a second. Let me see. Yes, I should tell you, of course, the title of today's lecture, which you already know, but I will repeat it. The Angry Tide, Reflections on Fascism, Resentment, and Authoritarian Dreams. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Hansen.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I am absolutely thrilled and honored to be here as the Yosin Speaker of the Year. It's a great honor. It's also a really great pleasure to be back at Habib, as Dr. Naqvi just alluded to. I met Habib University first time as a PowerPoint presentation about 12 years ago, and it's fantastic to be here, and it's fantastic to meet all the students and all the faculty in the last few days. So I am going to talk to you about the present by talking about the past. And I'm going to cover a whole lot of ground. I'll try to see if I can be done in about 35 minutes. There will be a lot of slides. I'm going to talk about the present, especially the kind of right-wing turn that we have seen. Oh, it doesn't. Here we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the sharp turn to the right across the world in the past decade or more. From India in 2014 to Trump's win in 2016, and again a few weeks ago to Brexit, Orban in Hungary. You can see some of the people here, Meloni in Italy, Milei in Argentina, Duterte in the Philippines. I could have added also Netanyahu, and I will talk a little bit about Zionism a little bit later. And they have all gained momentum in the past decade or so by pushing back against the increased visibility, pushing back against the effects of globalization, against liberal democracy, against multiculturalism, against the increased visibility of women in public life, against the recognition of racial, ethnic, and sexual identities and minorities across the world. And many commentators, academics, see this as these trends as a return and a turn to fascism. But I want to contemplate a little bit more in detail what does fascism actually mean. For most people it means a return of something really bad or scary, and you may know that even Trump calls all his enemies fascists. So the term itself is perhaps a little overfull. But fascism was, in my view, and I'll try to show this, just one manifestation, albeit a particularly violent one, of a much broader range of conservative and nationalist movement and ideologies that have opposed liberal freedom, democracy, principles of equality, but also effective global capitalism for more than a century. So I want to start by going back to the beginning of the 20th century to look at the roots really of what we think of as modern right-wing politics. This was the peak of the power of Europe's empire, of intense economic globalization, a time where Western supremacy, social Darwinism, and scientific racism dominated public discourses across the world. It was also a time of growing anxiety in many quarters, and I'll mention just two of them. There was a great fear of the masses. With the rapid growth of large cities across the world, there were many fears of social unrest, a risk that all those newly urbanized, deracinated poor people would be swayed by new radical ideologies and religious fanaticism. There was a breakup of older aristocratic orders and an embrace of parliamentary democracy and political equality happening at the same time, all these were seen as a threat to the very stability of societies across the world. I put in 1905 as the year of fear and trembling of European empires, because 1905, or the early 20th century, was also a time where the Boxer Rebellion in China had challenged Western domination in East Asia in 1901, and where the defeat of Russia, resounding defeat of Russia by an ascendant Japan, had sent shockwaves through Europe, generating hysterical anxiety around what was known at the time as the Yellow Peril. The other major fear complex was a fear of alienation and individualization in a world increasingly shaped by capitalist dynamics, new technology, and a new mass society. Many conservatives and others were very wary of the alienation from religion, from family values, from patriarchy, respect for social hierarchy and authority, and wary of a growth of excessive individualism and hedonism. Now, if this all sounds a little familiar, it's because it is. It resonates with what we see today. Now, among philosophers and social theorists, there were several types of responses to these powerful global forces that seem to divide societies and create deep uncertainty and fear. And I'm going to talk the next maybe 15, 20 minutes, mainly about ideas and phenomena, and less about perhaps how they panned out on the ground, as we anthropologists are prone to do, but I'll dabble a little bit in intellectual history here. So, there are 4 responses. There were many more, but let me just mention 4 of them because I think they resonate in interesting ways with the present. On one hand, there was a strong tendency towards what we could call vitalism and organicism. That is, an idea taken from biology that societies and humans were like bounded biological organisms, integrated wholes animated by a common life force, what at the time in the early 20th century, a world-famous philosopher Bergson called élan vital, or vital spirit, and where societies were seen as interdependent in their functions. Another theorist that may be known to some of you is a biologist and philosopher called Hans Strich, who is kind of the father of modern organicist thinking. Most forms of cultural and religious and linguistic nationalism projected the national spirit at the time and collective memories as vital cause of a society and a people, a spirit that could be made and remade and made visible and tangible and something you could perceive and feel in mass rituals and mass gatherings at this time of emerging mass politics across the world. The other response was scientific racism, the study of human difference according to social biology, and as we know, social Darwinism, as it emerged after Darwin, and in many ways in violation of Darwin's thought, was originally devised to understand different races in the world, but in the beginning of the 20th century, they were sort of returning home, as it were, as eugenics, as ideas of improving the white race, preventing degeneracy, as it was called at the time, and preventing racial mixing. This morphed into anti-Semitism as a form of medicalized ideology, and also racism that portrayed Jews as sick and black people as mentally inferior, for example. The third response was what I call monism, which is the rejection of the divisibility of the world, promoting the idea of the oneness of the world, of a unity of experience, of the unity of a social body held together by shared religious beliefs, or perhaps a national spirit. This mode of thought manifested in the popularity of mysticism and Eastern spirituality in the early 20th century in Europe and North America, and many nationalists also saw the people and the nation as representing some form of transcendental spirit that could unify society and overcome the divisions of modernity that was felt to be ripping societies and selves apart. And the fourth response, which is not necessarily right-wing, was from socialists, the notion of egalitarianism, where socialists and fascists criticized the alienation of modern life and the inhumanity of degradation of urban industrial life under capitalism. But unlike monism, these forces deployed the idea of the fundamental divisibility of the world into antagonistic classes in order to project another society, eventually socialist or communist, where divisions and alienation would be overcome and replaced by a final unity based on radical egalitarianism. For fascists, there was only equality, and let's not forget that fascists were quite serious about equality, and there was only equality and redemption within a people united behind a leader. So these were some of the stirrings and the political conflicts that roiled across the world a century ago. And out of this grew two traditions that I'll talk about briefly before turning more to South Asia. One was what you could call conservative integralism that grew among intellectuals in Spain, Italy, and France, mainly based on a strict interpretation of the Catholic tradition and ethos. The godfather of this movement is Donoso Cortés. Actually, he is a Spanish nobleman and descendant of Hernán Cortés, the conquistador. He started as an ardent liberal, inspired by Rousseau, John Locke, and others, but he soon turned to a strong conservative critique of political and economic liberalism as it was flourishing in the Anglo-Saxon world and across empires, dynamics that he thought would be a threat to the social order and to Christian values. He argued that only an enlightened dictatorship and a more closed economy could save Christian civilization. These trends and the embrace of, it was a form of social monism centered on the Catholic Church and Catholic values, was staunchly opposed to unions, to social equality, to socialism, and it became quite dominant across the right in Southern Europe and Latin America, in fact, in much of the 20th century. And also influential in North America, although Catholics enjoyed much less political influence there into the 1970s. If you study the composition of the current US Supreme Court, you will find that many of the most conservative members belong to this strand of Catholic integralism. In the interwar years, I forgot one thing. Another strand of this was Opus Dei that was created, and a Catholic lay organization created in 1928 it was an organization meant to work for social unity and Catholic principles as the foundation for ordinary social life. It was founded by this man on the other side, José María Escrivá, and it functioned as it still is a very widespread organization, very influential on the Latin American right, was very influential on Francisco Franco, the dictator of Spain, and also Salazar, the dictator of Portugal, and Pinochet in Chile. And also, you may or may not know, there's something called the Project 2025, which is the sort of blueprint for what a second coming of Trump would look like. And now the second coming has, and Trump distanced himself from this document during the electoral campaign, and now it's like, ha, 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 we actually meant it. And now they are beginning to actually implement elements, or certainly making noises to that effect, and in some of the appointments. And Project 2025 is authored by people who belong, the main author behind it is actually is a prominent member of Opus Dei in America. So it's all here. It's all come home, as it were, and come back. The other iteration of this was something called Action Française, which gained much traction in France under the leadership of Charles Maurras. He's the gentleman with the beard, the stern-looking gentleman in the corner, who is considered the most influential conservative intellectual in the 20th century. He went on to support the Vichy collaborationist regime during World War II. He was anti-Semitic, but he was first and foremost anti-socialist. He was a monarchist, self-avowed anti-modernist, and a proponent of what he called integral nationalism. Murat influenced many people, and his confrontational style of speaking and debating inspired many others, including the infamous racist and anti-Semitic Catholic priest called Father Coughlin, who you see on top here, who is sort of, in some ways, the pioneer of modern American sort of right-wing populism on the radio. He was a very famous radio personality already in the 1930s. Interestingly, another gentleman you might know, called Steve Bannon, up in the corner here, has on many occasions expressed admiration for Murat. And down in the corner we have Bergson, the prophet of Elan Vital, and he himself, born Jewish, converted to Catholicism and became member of Action Française. So what is then national integralism? It's a project that's centered on national unity, national spirit, social harmony, religious values, majoritarianism, racism, anti-Semitism, militarism, opposition to socialism, and so on and so forth. But it wasn't fascism. Fascism was something quite different. And fascism, as we know it, and has become this blanket term that is thrown around perhaps a little bit too much at times, started in Italy, and Mussolini, as you may know, started actually as a revolutionary socialist, and many of his early inspirations were definitely on the left, but also on this sort of journey towards the right. One of them is D'Annunzio, who is a celebrated, I misspelled it here, I'm sorry, who was a war hero, is a poet who veered from the left to the right during World War I, and began to embrace what became known as corporatism, an anti-socialist idea of the economy that should be, according to D'Annunzio, should be regulated as a negotiated whole between established interests, a model that became very popular in Spain and Portugal later on in the century. Another inspiration and fellow traveler of Mussolini was Filippo Marinetti, who was a founder of the futurist movement, celebrating the power of machines. That was another big inspiration for Mussolini and fascism. And this brand, this fascism, which takes its name from the Roman sign of honor, which is the fascus, which is what the Roman centurions and other notables would wear as signs of their rank, grows out of the disillusionment after World War I in Italy and Germany, drawing many recruits from war veterans and otherwise mobilized members of the left, workers, intellectuals, and others. It was brash, it was decidedly secular, anti-clerical, modernist, embraced technology and the power of the human will, celebrated the national spirit and the people as one. Unlike national integralism, fascism was also intensely driven by the idea of a deep and perpetual antagonism, enmity and violence as decisive and necessary and formative for the future and of the future. It was also racist and anti-Semitic, as we know, and over time began to actually forge a relationship with the Catholic Church, another chapter we can always discuss. That's one variety, and the other one is the more well-known National Socialism, which I think we often forget was exactly that. It was nationalist and socialist. Opposed to the left, militaristic, secular, embracing classical Germanic values, body culture, including nudism, in fact, radically anti-Semitic with elements of anti-capitalism in its early version, based on street brawlers and ex-soldiers in a movement that only in the 1930s became more respectable. Nazi ideology, as you will probably know, revolved around what Alfred Rosenberg, who was an important ideologue of the Nazi movement, called the myth of the 20th century, Aryanism, the spirit of the Aryan Germanic people that needed to be set itself free from Jewish influences and degeneracy and free from Christian dogma and institutions in order to regain its world-conquering destiny led by the great leader. There was an unmistakable egalitarianism in this project, an idea of leveling social differences and unifying as one people, as one folk. I'm going to move to Japan quickly, but because something also happened there that is worth our attention. As you know, Japan was modernizing very rapidly in the late 19th century, what is called the Meiji Restoration and modernization from above. And the resounding victory over Russia in 1905 propelled a new wave of extreme nationalism, as well as pan-Asian ideas, usually with Japan in the role as a liberator of Asia from Western domination, some of them liberatory, and some of them envisioning a Japanese supremacist empire subjugating the lesser races of Asia. So if we remember our four themes above, they were all combined in intriguing ways by this author who is sometimes known as the godfather of Japanese fascism, Ikki Kita. Originally a socialist and a radical modernist deeply interested in revolutionary forces in China, Kita returned to Japan and he published an outline plan for the reorganization of Japan that advocated socialism from above as a form of corporatism instead of class struggle, and he advocated territorial expansion to unify Asia under Japanese leadership, but acknowledging the rights of other people and suggesting, very interestingly, to have as a lingua franca Esperanto, which was very popular at the time. He was actually executed in 1936 for an alleged attempt to be part of a coup d'etat by ultra-nationalist officers and intellectuals in Japan that were hoping to realize a radical reorganization of the country. But as they executed Kita, they also took up many of his ideas and ideas of other right-wing figures around what became known as Showa statism, or corporatist monist idea of Japan led by the emperor, the military, and major corporations, animated by a new expansionist, Japanese supremacist and racial ideology. And the rest, as we know, is history, albeit an extremely violent one. Before I turn to South Asia, let me just draw your attention in order to show how much of the present reverberates with what happened a century ago. Let me just turn to what happened in Palestine. In fact, not yet Palestine at the time. Theodor Herzl, known as the father of modern Zionism, was for decades advocating for creation of a Jewish state, and this was well before Nazism, well before all the awful events of the 1930s and 40s. He advocated for Zionism as a solution to the problem of anti-Semitism and the persecution of Jews in Europe, but also as a way of realizing the Jewish spirit in a nation state of its own. And you can see here, I'm not going to read this out, but he saw himself as part of, and he advocated for the creation of a Jewish state as part of the colonial enterprise. He, in fact, wrote letters, fawning letters to Cecil Rhodes, the arch-imperialist, where he advocated and said, you know, Britain and France should help create this state in the Middle East. And it's interesting that in a letter to a friend in 1903, he says this, right? Let us seize the opportunity to become a miniature England. Let's begin by acquiring our own colonies, and so on and so forth. There's a lot known about Theodor Herzl that rarely enters the conversation about what Zionism is today or what anti-Semitism might mean. But this is him advocating for this in this particular political and historical context. And here is a little excerpt from an article written in The Guardian in 1918 by a British military expert who basically argues that this is a mighty good idea, and it actually led to Britain, of course, recognizing the right for Jews to begin to colonize and settle in Palestine. and to protect that project that led to Israel later on. But it was this idea that based entirely on imperial racial ideology that Jews would be people of European persuasions and sentiments and convictions and predilections that would create a form of buffer zone in the Middle East between the East and the West, as it were. And that is in some ways an incredibly prophetic statement. He also says that this might be a model we might want to work with in British India. So that's just a little interjection here. Let's come back closer to where we are today. And in South Asia. And so how did this play out, these big trends that were circulating around the world at the time? The fear of the masses, the fear of alienation, and so on and so forth. By the beginning of the 20th century, the big fault line across South Asia is really between those who are left and liberal nationalists and modernists advocating for the modernization of British India and increased political representation versus those who you could say embrace various varieties of monist thought or monistic thought, especially the Vedanta and Sanatana tradition in India, what is today India, but also reform movements like the Arya Samaj in North India, which offered another version of monism based on a modernized and rationalized version of Hinduism. Muslim reform movements skeptical of the divisive and splintering effects of colonial modernity, capitalism, and new class hierarchies, mobilized to make Islam stronger and purer by returning to its textual and ethical roots and make Islam the center of political life. And so those were the sort of big forces at play there, and I won't go into the details, which we can discuss later. But the embrace of such monistic thinking or the fascination with vitalist and organicist thought doesn't necessarily make one a fascist or even an integralist as such. Maybe a conservative or maybe an integralist. Think of how important Bergson's thought and vitalist philosophy was to a figure like Iqbal and many other intellectuals at the time, or how Gandhi combined a conservative caste Hindu outlook with his belief in the existence of a semi-transcendent truth, a truth force culled from many different religious traditions. But there are a few candidates that perhaps come closer to fascism or fascist adjacent beliefs and practices on account of their modernist rejection of religious traditions. One such figure was Benoît Sarkar, a socialist of great reputation in the 1910s and 20s. He wrote a 1922 book called The Futurism of Young Asia, where he criticized the conventional embrace of Advaita Vedanta, the non-dualist idea of oneness of humans, nature, and universe. This philosophy was precisely, he said, what had held back India for centuries, and it had to be dispensed with. However, Sarkar also rejected socialism and Marxist thought on the ground that although it projected a resolution or projected the inherent contradictions of the world, it also projected a resolution of them to stop the dialectic between different opposing and antagonistic classes, as it were, after the revolution. And he thought that was not going far enough. Instead, he got ever more enamored by the mobilization of racial identity, a strong state military power in Japan. He wrote in a very celebratory way about Japan and the spirit, what he called the spirit of 1905, and he saw that as a path to follow for India and other colonized nations. The other obvious candidate on the slide is Subhash Chandra Bose, who, as you may know, began as a radical nationalist in Bengal, but he developed increasing differences with Gandhi and the idea of nonviolent resistance. He was the first to organize a uniformed volunteer corps to protect the party's meetings and processions. Later, as you may all know, he escaped from a colonial prison to travel to Nazi Germany in 1941, and later to Japan, where the government assisted Bose in setting up the Indian National Army in Singapore during the war. Bose was a nationalist who thought that fascism and socialism ought to merge, but he was not really an atheist. He believed And he actually believed that the Bhagavad Gita was a perfect guide to an ethical life, a passion he shared with several leading Nazis. As you may know, Himmler and Goebbels were reportedly or reputedly carried around mini versions of the Bhagavad Gita in their pockets. I don't know if that's an apocryphal story, but they were definitely close to this sort of idea of classical Indian thought as a guide, as an ethical guide. The person who perhaps comes closest to what we would think of as a fascist figure in South Asia is Savarkar, V.D. Savarkar. In 1923, in his work from 1923, The Essentials of Hindutva, he outlines how the only way a broader Hindu tradition can be unified is to posit a fundamental enmity between Hindus, that is, those who are born in India and see it as fatherland and holy land, and those who do not, principally Muslims, who have what, in his words, extraterritorial loyalties. In one move, he defined a people yet to be actually unified in practice, and a territory and a perennial enemy, a formula that inspired also the formation of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh I'll come to in a second. Like the European fascists, Savarkar was an atheist. He had little time for piety or the petty rules of caste segregation, rules that he saw as dividing the Hindu nation or the Hindu nation to be. Savarkar was also fascinated by war, and his very first book was actually on the Great Rebellion of 1857, and his last book was also about war, called The Six Glorious Epochs of Indian History, and those books focused on rewriting Indian history as a history of a martial race, a history of war, conflict, and manly valor, moving towards a unified nation, a nation that was historically latent but in need of rebirth, like most national projects. As you know, nations exist latently, nationalists will say, but they constantly have to be rekindled and reinvented in order to actually exist. Savarkar himself was not a great innovator of political forms, and the Hindu Mahasabha, his political party, was always a fairly standard political organization, contesting elections and so on and so forth. However, it was RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, that created an organizational form that came closest to the fascist movements of Europe, at least as far as uniforms, drills, discipline, strict hierarchies, etc. Are concerned, and yet perhaps not. So while Savarkar was an ardent modernist who believed that Hindu society needed deep reform and organization to emerge as a modern political nation and political creed beyond caste and tradition, RSS was more moderate in its aims to organize and express Hindu society as it was, in the way it was, including traditional gender, caste, ideologies, and so on and so forth, rather than to change and reform it wholesale. Its roots lay in vigilante organizations formed to defend Hindu neighborhoods during times of tension and riots in the 1920s. But as it evolved, it came closer to a sort of corporatist, integralist vision, organizing all sectors of Hindu society in separate organizations, workers, students, tribals, youth, women, and so on. In the and you can see here, I just want to show you a few quotes here from M.S. Golwalkar, who was the RSS Supremo for almost 30 years, who in many ways shaped the organization, which is the backbone of the Hindu nationalist movement to this day, and who is very clear, especially in the second part, the second quote, that for him, the purpose of the RSS is perhaps less political sovereignty than it is building up strength and organizing Hindu society and building up physical strength and being able to defend oneself and create this kind of more healthy body and healthy society as a whole. In many ways, a complete sort of hyper-masculinist, but also completely in keeping with sort of integralism in the way that I have talked about it. In the 1960s, One of the leaders became leaders of the BJP later on. The political leader of what was called Jansang, Deen Dayal Upadhyay, published this book, Integral Humanism. It's a book that has taken its title directly from a book by the French integralist thinker called Jacques Maritain, and there's debate how much theft there was going on, but or whether it's just a bad translation from the Hindi, which is Ekata Manavat, which is a sort of one-spirit humanism, if you like, and in many ways trying to bring RSS closer to a kind of mainstream Vedanta thinking and perhaps a little away from the street brawling and so on and so forth, something that then has returned in the 1990s. But these two streams have always been struggling within the organization and the larger movement. There is a persistent tension between this sort of Savarkarite national modernism driven by relentless conflict with the enemy and the RSS that emphasizes cultural unity and organization of Hindu society around the simplified Hindu spirit. It manifests around the distaste among RSS cadres, or some, for a distaste for violent vigilante action against Muslims and other minorities, and also against what they see as the movement's overinvestment in electoral politics and the sort of semi-deification of Modi. Much evidence suggests, in fact, that the decline of BJP in North India in terms of votes in the May 1924 elections was, to some extent at least, because many RSS members did not join the campaigning and actually stayed at home. So before coming back to my starting point, let me just, because we are in Pakistan, I think I have to mention one figure who is perhaps not so much talked about these days. And this is Inayatullah Khan Masriki and his Kaksa movement of the 1930s that persisted into the late 40s and early 50s. I'm not sure how this briefly very popular and large movement is taught and remembered in Pakistan today, something we can perhaps discuss. Masriki himself was a highly educated man, mathematician among other things. He had traveled extensively in Europe in the 1920s. He founded the Kaksa movement as a movement that was clearly influenced by fascist and nationalist currents at the time, including the RSS and the Mahasabha. Like some of these movements, Masriki wanted to properly organize Indian Muslims, although his movement was open to all, but it was almost entirely Muslim membership, around modern principles of punctuality, military discipline, but also service and humility. In the US, Trump's coalition, as I'm sure you know from the news, is a rather odd assembly of people who voted for this man, stretching from white nationalist militia groups to the Catholic conservative project around 2025, white evangelicals, historically actually hostile, very hostile to Catholicism, neo-libertarians like Elon Musk and others, anti-government conservatives who hate the government but curiously also love the state, something we can talk about how that works in the US, plus a lot of young men who are rattled by the new gender fluidity, the pronoun regimes, and the general conspicuous success of women and minorities in American life. None of this actually amounts to fascism in any historically recognizable form, but there are many echoes of the past as the dominance of the West declines and an earlier Western confidence or arrogance is giving way to a pervasive sense of being beleaguered from all sides, domestically and internationally. To give you an example, the strong identification with Israel one finds among many American conservatives can at least in part be explained by a feeling and a strong feeling of pervasive threat from the rest of the world and the worship of overwhelming military force and technology as a defense against an outside world that is no longer legible and a domestic world that is experienced as increasingly culturally alien, as if taken over by those other people. I began with the two fear complexes of the early 20th century, fear of the unknowable masses and fear of alienation, as people experienced the opacity of society and changes, transformations caused by vast systemic forces. Those are still complexes of our time, albeit with different actors and content. Today, as you see on the slide, these masses are clearly, certainly in the US and Europe, are clearly migrants and asylum seekers from outside the West, and all the racial, ethnic, sexual categories that have been less visible in the past but have emerged much more visible, also known as what some people call the browning of America, wokeness, and so on and so forth. Things that really rattle, and it's very interesting how the current right-wing configuration in the US is so focused on sexuality, on gender ideology, and the male body, or any body, the sharp distinction, the policing of the boundary between male and female as something that is incredibly important to many. In South Asia, and as I've written in the Saffron Wave, the main argument there was that the BJP and the RSS coming to power and emerging at this time in the 1990s and now also the last 20 years is in many ways to be understood as what I call a conservative revolution that reacts to the increased visibility and voice of hitherto less visible communities and categories, lower castes, various minority groups, and so on and so forth. So the fear of the unknowable masses is still here, but it's in a different guise. The fear of alienation, as it is experienced today, is maybe first and foremost as an opacity of a society no longer recognizable, but permeated by vast systemic forces, technology, surveillance, and so on and so forth, what's on the slide. In South Asia, that fear of alienation is also pervasive, and the fear is that the danger comes from the decadence of consumer society, new gender ideologies, the enemy within, treasonous religious and social minorities. These are ideas that are very widely spread among conservative Indians, but also, I believe, conservative-minded Pakistanis. So let me close with one reflection, that the shock that I began with, that produced the first wave, you can say, of right-wing politics, thank you, was in fact, in many ways, the beginning of the decay of empire, and was the shock of World War I, right? That produced as a response these new political forms that took over the world for a long time. The shock this time is different. It's actually not a shock, but it's a slow, gradual democratization, in fact, in many ways, coming to the fore of various new faces of Western societies and societies in South Asia and many other parts of the world, a new fluidity of identities and new gender fluidity, for instance. And what's interesting is to contemplate, and I'll end with this, what the remedy might be. I think many people, as we saw in the presidential campaign in the US, where Kamala Harris' main argument was we have to save American democracy from Trump, was that the remedy, often as held up to these forces, is to have more democracy and more freedom, and I actually agree with that, but we also have to bear in mind that precisely the success of democracy, the success of expanding forms of visibility and emancipation that have produced many of these reactions in the first place. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for that very stimulating discussion of this very, very disturbing reality of ours that we are, spiraling into. I have many, many questions. I will only ask, obviously, a couple of them. That's the sign of a good talk, when it generates so many questions. The first obvious question seems to me, because it has such overlap with a book in our field, your and my South Asian studies field, The Politics of Self-Expression by Marcus Dexel, the Urdu middle class milieu from the 1930s to the 1950s, in which he also talks about this ambient, he says ambient kind of background noise around the entire spectrum, the entire political spectrum. So not just the obvious candidates like Savarkar and the RSS, etc. So I'm right now just talking about South Asia, and he's saying, of course, it's global, just like you're saying it's global. It was global then, it's global now. But also, more unlikely, somebody like Bose, Subhash Chandra Bose, and of course, he also mentions Allama Mashriqi. But in terms of diagnosis, one part of his argument is that it coincides with the coming into existence of consumerism. That consumerism played a big part in the kind of hyperactive imagination, phantasmatic intellectual space, thanks to advertising, for example, that people came to inhabit, and the kinds of narcissistic subjectivities, the kinds of narcissistic subjectivities that came into existence as a result of consumerism. So, what would you say in terms of that part of how to understand the phenomenon today?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's definitely an argument to be made. I think in case of Mark Dexel's argument in that book, I think it's an argument I will buy a lot more when it comes to what happened in Germany or Italy maybe, or other places in Europe. I'm less sure about how much consumerism was a major factor in the growth, let's say, of militancy or the attraction to these forms of movements across British India at the time. I'm not entirely sure, because I think that access to modern consumer goods and whatever, it was the beginning of advertising, there was a spectacle, but in reality it reached rather few, and it was mainly urban phenomena. Of course, Mashriqi's movement, like also was the case with the beginning of the Hindu right, were of course drawn from the middle classes and lower middle classes and so on and so forth, who were alarmed by this kind of challenge to ordinary morality and so on and so forth. So there is something to it, certainly in terms of the attraction. If you think of German history, it's very clear that the sort of what is known as the Wild 20s in Germany, right, which is really an expression of cultural avant-gardism of many kinds, was a direct provocation, and it actually pushed many otherwise people who were otherwise maybe not vested in street violence towards the Nazis, because they would rather have that rather than these sort of decadent people in Berlin and elsewhere doing all this stuff. So I think there is a correlation between these two. I think in today's society, it's very interesting that when I was doing my work in India in the early 90s, and liberalization began in a big way in India, there was a very interesting debate going on within the RSS, for instance, about what to do with this, right? And there was a very strong opinion that Swadeshi principles of saying no to foreign goods and reviving the Swadeshi spirit of the colonial era was one pathway, partly as political opposition to the Congress, but as much more, in fact, a form of provocation that this new consumer society, which really arrived in India much faster, within a decade, you can say the face of Indian cities had actually transformed in a very radical and visible way. And that became, surely, but it came with many other things. It also came with the articulation of these other groups from lower caste communities and other communities. All of a sudden there were new faces in politics, new faces on TV, and so on and so forth. There was this sense of a radical opacity of society, a sort of an unraveling of certitudes, and that was very obvious when I was talking to people at that time, that this was something that drove them towards a political party and a political organization that they otherwise would not have thought of supporting, right? So I think there is something going on there, and it's definitely also, if you look at right-wing configurations elsewhere, right? The question of morality, there it's sort of the focus on sexuality, the focus on self-formation, right? What should the self be? How far can the limits of the self be pushed, and so on and so forth. And American conservatives are very, very concerned with these things, also concerned with, in a sense, an excessive individualism, maybe less consumerism, but more like an excessive individualism that actually leads to all these demands for, book bans and the protection of young minds and all these things.
Right, thank you. That's very illuminating. The other question I had was with respect to, so you had vitalism and organicism, scientific racism, monism, and egalitarianism. So, two remarks about this. I don't know if this is always an awkward question to ask, but there are millions of books, and I haven't read much of what you have written, and it works the other way around. But Richard Overy, this recent book, Blood and Ruins, which is about, he calls it the last imperial war, from 1931 to 1945. But he argues, so he's making a case that you need to look at World War II itself as from the period from the late 1880s through the First World War and towards the Second World War, through so the period of new imperialism. Yeah, from the 1880s onwards. So I see you don't have imperialism in your list, and to my mind, it's a pretty important component of fascist ideology.
Yes, it is. I mean, I didn't put it there because imperialism was already going on, as it were. It was fully unfolding. It was, in fact, the background of all of these things, and it was, in fact, imperialism that enabled many of the economic and political transformations that happened in Europe and America at the time. So it was not a coherent intellectual response. I was more like looking at or thinking about what were the responses among academics and intellectuals and thinkers to respond to these kind of transformations. Imperialism was, in fact, such a common sense that we often today, and we all know these conversations in classrooms where people are saying, oh, how can you teach so-and-so, and wasn't he a racist, and wasn't he supporting this and that, and or whatever. And during the time, and it's everybody, including many people we would otherwise see as sort of progressives in Europe, including celebrated figures, would have rather retrograde things to say about the empire and about the imperial order of things. So I didn't put it there because it was kind of a common sense. It was a common sense so deep that even people belonging to the Frankfurt School tradition and so on and so forth would at times write things that were really quite cringy for this day and age, and even much earlier than that. So that's why. But I think you're right that fascism was in many ways predicated on the idea of the realization of the spirit of a people based on territorial expansion and realization of the destiny of that people, right? That's manifestly the case with the Japanese, with the Germans, and so on. And in Germany is obviously a sort of long-held this idea that Germany came late to the imperialist party and missed out on it and only had a few colonies, but when the opportunity arose, and it was already clearly a rhetoric that was there, and you see it even during World War I and after World War I, the push into the East and the attempt to push back the Reds, as it were, and take over parts of Eastern Europe. So that project, that idea of looking at Eastern Europe as a kind of German territory is very old, right? So you're absolutely right. And as we know, the Italian fascists went to war in Ethiopia and Libya and so on. So yes, it's definitely a part of it, but it's a form of imperialism that's kind of a new kind of imperialism, different from the older one, right? This is an imperialism that's about annexation. In some ways, that's why I also put in the Zionist project. That's actually a project about a different kind of colonization. This is really a sort of settler colonial idea, right? That you take over and you actually remove the existing populations or make them into slaves, right? And that's the older imperialism was, of course, based a lot more on capitalist logics and forms of extraction and so on and so forth. This was a project that was not necessarily based on economy. It was based on this sort of idea of a realization of a particular nation and its historical destiny, right?
And to what extent is that in play today? Because we see it in the case of Russia, and we also see it now in the case of Israel, where they're also talking about exactly settler colonialism.
I mean, there's certainly radical, we hear there is like, the new, from the river to the sea, there's some of the settler movements, right, that talk about the river is not River Jordan, but actually it's actually Euphrates and Tigris to the sea. And that's, of course, a very disturbing idea. So it's playing out, that spectacle is playing out. I don't know that, I want to say to the larger question of when you look at this, paint the sort of broader canvas, and lots of stuff I left out. I could have talked about Turkey and Eastern Europe and so on and so forth, lots of other places. I think sometimes there is a kind of historical, some historical optics that lead us to not see things as they were articulated at the time, right? Because in 1930 or 36, you can say, Maastricht, he didn't know that fascism would lead to what it led to, right? To the Holocaust and World War II and all that. Nobody knew. It was not clear what the Japanese expansionism would lead to and so forth. So a lot of our assessments and understandings of what fascism is and authoritarianism is are based on these kinds of the outcomes that they led to, right? And in some cases. And I think that can sometimes blind us to the fact that a lot of these movements were seen as a lot more sort of plausible for ordinary people at the time in the 1920s and 30s. It was one among other things, right? Including many of the Zionists who signed up and come to Israel and all that, who came with, many of them with very utopian ideas of what Israel could be, maybe very naive ideas about what could be done, and maybe blinding themselves to the displacement of Arabs that had to happen in order for that to take place. But it was at a peace with the kind of standard operating practices of European settler colonialism at the time, right? That's the point. And I think we need to remember that, there is a tendency where we discuss fascism is we go to the extreme point, right? And rather we should understand how it is that some of these ideas become utterly acceptable and utterly, plausible for lots of people, because we don't know where the end point is. Right? We know that what happened in the interwar years, we don't know what the end point is today. Right? And that's why you can have people who have very fascist adjacent ideas who at the same time can declare that their enemies are fascists, right? That they're not, they deny it. So because fascism has got this particular kind of valence of being this extreme evil, but it's a way of looking at it that actually blinds us to the complexity of what made fascism what it was.
I do think that putting such a fine point on it, because there's been a lot of this debate about whether Trump it's less now, as you know.
Yeah.
Paxton, for instance, has now come out and said, yes, he's a fascist. Some of these scholars of fascism who were arguing he wasn't earlier. Yeah. So And of course, I mean, every other regime, whether it's liberalism, socialism, whatever regime you're talking about, you expect some variation across time and space in the form of that particular state form. Why should that not be the case with fascism?
Right.
But you can answer that if you want or not, but I really think we should give the audience the opportunity. So the first person I see is Mehdi. Please, can you ask?
Thank you. So you spoke about egalitarianism, but fascist movements are sort of like, at least in Germany, for example, like large corporations like Mercedes and, you know, these corporations were backing up sort of fascist movements as a means of sort of thinking of advantages to themselves. And perhaps, do you see a similar phenomenon, for example, people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel sort of like backing up Trump, or is similarly in India, where, you know, the Ambanis and the Bollywood stars are sort of backing up Modi? Thank you.
So let me thank you, Mehdi. The egalitarianism of fascist or fascist adjacent movements is actually a very interesting point, because it can coexist with this kind of sponsorship from big corporations. As you may know from German history, is only actually at the very end, it's only from the mid-1930s when the military has sort of decided to allow, and sort of big political interests have decided to allow Hitler to have a go, because they didn't know whether he was a madman. They thought he was a total disaster and a madman. They decided to let him have a go at it. And then they put in their lot, and they put in the investments behind it, and so on. So it was not necessarily because these groups would buy into the entirety of the fascist program, including the Holocaust. Absolutely not necessarily a part of their plan, right? They would supply weapons. They would make millions and billions out of this. They would be part of the infrastructure that also enabled the Holocaust and all that, which is absolutely true. But from the get-go, it was not necessarily a commitment to the fascist ideology as a whole, and definitely not to the egalitarian dreams that were very much part of the early iterations, right? This idea of unity and dignity behind the leader who could then raise the. Don't forget that the German one of the biggest arguments for German fascism was to undo the humiliation of the loss of World War I, right? And the betrayal of the Western powers and so on and so forth. So, and that idea of undoing humiliation, right, is there. It's there. We see it in many other places, right? We see it also in the Hindu nationalist movement in India, for sure, right? Some of these big corporations are supporting the government of the time, right? And they are trying to optimize their conditions at all points. I don't know how much loyalty any of these corporations will have to the regime next time, or to a particular party. I know for a fact that it's very well known in India, and I'm not sure entirely how it works in Pakistan, but big corporations give money to all political parties. You play all horses because you don't know which horse is going to win, right? And it's a real thing. I mean, elections are real things. And that's also true in the US. So as we know, Elon Musk is a late convert to Trumpism. Is he a convert? Is his ego too big to be next to Trump's ego, which is even bigger? Let's see. My prediction is not very long. So I think there has been a tendency, especially among Marxist scholars, to reduce fascism to the outcome of a kind of capitalist conspiracy, right? I think that's very that misses a lot of the details and misses what is the lure and the attraction of some of these, the mass attraction of some of these movements, which has nothing to do necessarily with the interest of corporations. The interest of corporations are to be with whatever the prevailing power is and optimize their interest under a given regime. And I think that's universally true across the board. I'm not trying to whitewash anything. I'm just saying that I think that the rationales that govern these big corporations are not about really believing in one ideology or the other.
Okay, now there are many, many hands, and I've been watching all the hands going up. Obviously we don't have the time for all of those people to be addressed. I would like, sorry?
We can bundle a few.
We can try that, but Habib students, yes, okay. Firdaus.
Thank you. You kind of mentioned in your lecture, right, that a lot of what we are seeing in this new emergence of a fascist kind of regimes globally, they are in response to, for example, the 2010s queer emancipation that we saw taking place globally, even over here in Pakistan. This new emergence of, gender, sexual minorities kind of becoming queer citizens, respectable, productive citizens, so on and so forth. But you kind of really brush with that idea. I think it would be very helpful if you could maybe expand what is it about this fascist ideology that is so obsessed with gender and sexual regimes? What is the biopolitics of fascism? This might be a very unnecessarily loaded term in that regard, but what is the biopolitics of fascism that makes it so keen on talking about this particular strand?
Yeah, thank you. I'll hold that. We can take a few more.
Professor Najib Jan, please. He also has a question.
Thank you for a very engaging and thought-provoking talk. I sort of wanted to follow up on something that Nauman had said. I detected, and maybe incorrectly, a slight hesitation that you sort of expressed in using the term fascism really to describe Trump, for instance, or a number of these sort of contemporary movements that we're really, in the thick of. And I get the reason, in part, why you said that, because fascism is a big word and it sort of overshadows everything else, so we might miss out on the way in which everyday practices, sort of more normative practices, contain elements of a fascistic ethos, and we might sort of not get that. But I'm kind of wondering, do you think that the MAGA movement, in particular in the United States, is fascist? And if not, what would it take for you to say, okay, yes, now we're in a full-blown fascist era? Like, what are the red lines that he hasn't crossed yet that you think tick the box of real fascism?
I'll take those two together. Thank you. Well, I mean, I'll give you a really anthropology answer, which is to say that the term fascism was a specific configuration of these much wider movements, right? So we use fascism as a descriptor for all these different movements, and that it has its limitations, right? I think fascism, there's a very interesting work, a fantastic work on Italy and how we can understand the specificities of how that came into being, the distinct differences with Germany and so on. We call it all fascism because that's become the social science, as it were, lingo, right? I'm questioning whether that is helpful. I'm questioning because as I said in my answer to Nauman, that it is charged with an enormous burden of evil, as it were, right? Of historical evil, of world historical evil. And that means that its power of description is always freighted with that, right? So I'm not sure how useful it is. That's my hesitation, and I'll come to the biopolitics of it. The MAGA movement, it could be, I think, in every country, and I think my examples bore that out, that every place has its own configuration and articulation of some of these wider tendencies and ideologies and ideas of what society should be and how people analyze the malady of their own society, many of which are global maladies, but they manifest in particular ways. Same in the US. The US has, people often go and say, oh, there was Lindbergh, the famous aviator, who was leading this fascist manifestly and called themselves fascist party in the US in 1930s. And they go there, but I don't think this is the right place to look for it. I think the right place to look for it is to look at, Father Coughlin and to look at the configuration of what in this famous book, from the not so famous, long forgotten book, but now revived book from 1962 by Richard Hofstadter, called The Paranoid Style in American Politics, which is written as a reflection on the Cold War, where he says in that very perceptive book, he says, look, there has always been in America about 30% of the population that believe in absolute outlandish theories, and it goes back to the Great Awakening of the 1830s and 40s. It's been a constant of American society, and that manifests in various ways. It's particularly strong in the South, for instance, which because it's laced also with racial anxieties and hysterias, and so on and so forth. So he says, he wanted to explain McCarthyism. Why did people go so crazy? And he said, it's because they were able to tap into this layer of this substrata that we now actually have been able to see and hear on social media in ways that suggest that this is all new, but it's not. It's not new at all. It's been there for a really long time. It's a manifestly anti-democratic substratum of American society where people believe in the Constitution, but believe in it in a sort of highly racist and restricted way, and it's only for us. And this is a form of a picture of American society that for a long time has been very concerned about the way American society is moving, right? Morally, racially, and all that kind of stuff. So if the MAGA movement is turning, it's attracting some of those folks. So if it's going to manifest in something, it's not, I don't think American fascism, if there is such a thing, will be something that's recognizable fascist, right? It'll be Disneyfied, it'll be full of hyper-commercialization, it'll be full of what American culture already defines American culture. So I think so that's my general answer. To the question of the body, this is a very old theme that goes back to the 19th century, to sort of the obsession with the body in the Victorian age, the German invention of modern gymnastics as a way of cultivating. I mean, it's very informed by racial ideas of white supremacy, really, of how the white body has to be, the body has to be superior. But they took these. There's a wonderful book about Egypt by Wilson Jacob, where he talks about how British colonial officials and soldiers and so on brought these bodybuilding techniques to Egypt. And a lot of it was to show to the effeminate Egyptian the superiority of the hard and manly European body. All of that happened in India too. So this obsession with the male body as a symbol of a particular society is something that runs very deep, and it of course has its sort of most spectacular expression in Nazism, but it has deep and multiple roots, and of course when that is such a cherished representation of what the nation or the people or whatever should be, of course any kind of suggestion that there is some instability is very provoking. It's interesting, though, that these movements, including the RSS, including the early Nazi movements, were rife with homosexuality, right? The very thing that they were railing against, right? It's very well known. Ernst Röhm, who was the first leader of the SR, the sort of precursor to SS, he was murdered, reportedly by a jealous lover, right? And so on and so forth. So this is, it's in a sense the devil that lives at home, right? It's the devil inside the body that has to be constantly disciplined and controlled and all that. And so that's, I think, why this obsession with gender is so prevalent and so, and I think American masculinity is about the same thing. It's also, the very essence of what, the Marlboro Man kind of America, right? That people are still attached to.
Right, excellent. Well,
by the way, this talk is the Yosin lecture series is sponsored or hosted by the President's Office, who is, of course, my ultimate boss. I have other bosses between the President and myself. So I just follow orders, okay? So don't kill me after this, right? So, but thank you so much.
What do you mean?
Professor
Are you
Thomas.
going to get in trouble? Is that it?
Well, I mean, there are many, many people who want to ask questions, but we have to. We just have to. And now,
okay.
Thank you so much, Professor
Thank you.
Blom Hansen. I'd like to ask President Rizvi to please come and present memento to Professor Hansen.